Hi, I'm Manny Delacruz. I'm going to be replacing the ball joints on a 1998 Dodge Ram 4x4. It's a solid axle, a Dana 44 axle. I'm going to jack the truck up and get started. Alright, so we got the wheel off. Point it there. We got the wheel off, and what I've done is jack the car up. And the first thing I'm going to focus on is removing the brake caliper. There's actually two bolts behind the brake caliper. I'm going to undo those, and then see that piece of rope back there? I'm going to hang the caliper by the rope so that I don't stress the brake line. And then after that's complete, I've just squirted some kind of penetrant on this giant nut. I've got a breaker bar and a cheater bar and all sorts of fun stuff. I'm going to pull that nut off. But before that, I'm going to pull, like I said, caliper, and then I'm going to pull the brake disc. Okay, as you can see, I've removed the caliper. It's hanging by a rope, and I've also removed the brake disc, and that sort of exposes the hub and the axle nut. Now, this axle nut is a 42 point something millimeter, or 1 11/16 axle nut. I'm going to use a 45 millimeter axle nut, 45 millimeter socket, which will work just fine, but I got to pull that pin, and after I get it all wedged up, before I start turning that nut, I'll show you how I keep that hub from turning when I spin that nut. Okay, so the next thing I got to do before I remove that giant axle nut is to remove this castle nut and then disconnect this tie rod end. In order to get the proper leverage on this castle nut, I need to be able to move that steering knuckle around. This castle nut here, I need to move the steering. I need to be able to move this steering knuckle around. This is that whole thing. And then once the steering knuckle is able to be moved around, then I should be able to adjust that breaker bar and that giant cheater bar with that giant 45 millimeter socket. But first, I'm gonna bust loose this castle nut and bust loose this tie rod end. Alright, so what I've done is instead of using a pickle fork, which I think is one of the stupidest tools ever invented, I've got this I guess it's another type of ball joint press, or maybe it's a bearing puller, but I'm going to use that to bust loose the end of that tie rod. All I have to do is tighten that nut and then tap it with a brass hammer, and it should come loose. Okay, so as you can see, the end of the tie rod has been disconnected. Remove that castle nut. It's disconnected from the steering knuckle, and everything sort of popped loose. Nice and easy. Give it a little tap. Off it went. Alright, so hopefully, as you can see, I've got my 45 millimeter socket over the end of the nut. I've removed the cotter pin, and then I've got a ratchet. This is not a 1/2 inch, but 3/4 inch breaker bar, and then there's a cheater bar over it. And to keep the hub from spinning, I've got a Moses rod. I call it a Moses rod. Really, it's just a big old giant pry bar. It's about 6 feet long. It runs all the way to the ground, but it's actually wedged up between these two lug nuts, and that seems to be enough purchase. I've done this before. It worked okay. So I'm about to try it again. See if we can bust that rusty nut loose using my cheater bar. Okay. All right. That worked great. I didn't have any problems busting that nut loose. That sounds funny. I've got the 45 millimeter socket, and I'm turning on that nut. And there it is. Perfect. All right. Okay. So the next step is to remove these bolts right here. There's one up top, and there's two on the bottom right here, and then on the other side of the steering knuckle. Oh, you can't see, it's dark, but on this side. And one side, those are the steering hub to bearing hub, steering knuckle to bearing hub nuts, or bolts. Anyways, I got to remove those. So I'm going to do that next. And it's made a lot easier by disconnecting it from that tie rod bar, because then I can move that steering knuckle around as I see fit to get the best angle. All right, so I've loosened up those bolts, and all 3 bolts are loose. And then the next step is I'm not going to completely remove them. I'm just going to loosen them up a couple of turns. And then I'm going to take a hammer and I'm going to tap them gently. And hopefully what that will do is that will cause this bearing to be pushed out slightly. The tough thing to do is to get this hub off and then to extract the axle because of this hub bearing, which is usually seized into place. I mean, there's some rust that will hold it into place. This has never been done on this vehicle. It's got 198,000 miles on it, so I imagine that there's a little bit of rust holding this bearing and this front wheel bearing in place. So I'm going to tap these, like I said, tap these bolts back here, right here, and right here, and then that'll push the wheel bearing forward, and then I can extract the whole mess. Alright, so as you can see, this is the steering knuckle. I've removed the wheel bearing. It's sitting right over there. There's some brake dust flashing that goes around it. And where's that axle at? Oh, there it is on the ground. I've removed the axle shaft. So now what we have is a bare steering knuckle with the upper and the lower ball joints right down there. Can I get that in there? Let's see what we got here. Lower ball joints. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the upper ball joint. It's always easiest to remove the upper ball joint, and that'll give me some room to drop the lower ball joint. So upper ball joint first. Alright, so I've loosened the nut on the bottom ball joint, and I've also removed the castle nut on the top ball joint. And pretty much the only thing holding it in place is the friction of the steering knuckle and the spindles. So what I've got to do is I've got to take a big old hammer and I'm going to whack the steering knuckle right about right here. That's like the beefiest part of it. I don't want to distort it. And the shock of that should cause both of those spindles to let go. But what I also want to do is I also want to keep this nut on so that when it breaks loose it doesn't drop to the ground. So that's next. Alright, so it's loose. It worked. It took about 3 good solid whacks. I think this is like a 3-pound sledge or something. It's a little one. If you try to use a normal carpenter's hammer, there's just not enough weight in that to move that steering knuckle. But you got to use something with force. So just as a heads up. But because I kept that bottom nut on, the steering knuckle didn't fall off. So I'm about to remove that steering knuckle now. Alright, steering knuckle removed. There it is on the ground. Took a little bit more persuading with that hammer, but only about 3 or 4 more strokes. And then that's the upper ball joint, and that's the lower ball joint. And we're going to start by pressing them both. Start with pressing the upper ball joint out. Okay, so this is a ball joint press kit, and I rented it from, where did I go? Oh, AutoZone. I rented it from AutoZone. They require that you put a $100 deposit on it, and if you don't return it, you basically own it for $100. But I'm going to return and get my deposit back. But as you can see, there's a series of plates and tubes, and then a giant C-clamp. I'm going to stack these plates and tubes up on the top of that ball.